discussing on the physiology of cornea. The basic functions include the refractive media, transparency, absorption of topically applied drugs, and the protection. There are 5 different layers of cornea as we know. Here we'll be discussing on the nutrition, hydration, metabolism, and transparency of cornea. First, coming on to the first topic, corneal transparency. This was given by 2 different theories, the destructive theory given by David Morris and the diffraction theory by Goldman et al. This has 2 different factors. The first factor is the anatomical factor, which includes the absence of blood vessels, the non-myelinated fibers which lose the myelin sheath 1 to 2 mm away from the limbus. This sheathless nerves produce very little scattering of light, the packed stromal lamellae, and the uniform arrangement of epithelium. Coming on to the physiological factors, the stromal swelling pressure, the metabolic pump, the barrier function, evaporation from corneal surface, and the IOP. We'll be discussing all of these in details ahead. Next is the corneal hydration, which includes 4 factors: the stromal swelling pressure, which draws in water, the barrier mechanism, which prevents inflow of water, the metabolic pump, which pumps out water from cornea, and finally the evaporation from corneal surface. Now we'll be discussing on the stromal swelling pressure. This is basically exerted by the glycosaminoglycans that is present in stroma. These glycosaminoglycans are basically the negatively charged polysaccharides. Since we know that the stroma constitutes of about 90% of thickness of the cornea, this contains the GAG polysaccharides which are highly negatively charged. These negative charges repel each other and produce a pressure, that repulsion pressure that is generated. This is called the stromal swelling pressure. This is now very important to note that these negatively charged GAGs are very highly hydrophilic, because normally, as we know, that a cornea is 78% hydrated, but if we place that cornea inside an aqueous medium, it will absorb the water, swell up to 98%, and also increase its thickness very highly. This is the epithelium, this is this endothelium, and this is the middle portion is the stroma. Ideally, the intraocular pressure should always be less than the stromal pressure, but in cases when the stromal pressure becomes less as compared to the intraocular pressure exerted, in those cases that can lead to corneal edema. The stromal swelling is due to interfibrillary imbibition of water and not swelling of collagen fibrils. That is because of the negatively charged GAG polysaccharides, which has high affinity, highly hydrophilic towards the water, and hence that leads to the absorption of water and swelling of stroma, and not because of the swelling of the collagen fibrils itself. Now we'll be discussing on the barrier mechanisms. This includes 2 different layers of the cornea, the epithelium and the endothelium. The epithelium layer is very closely and tightly packed and hence acts as a very good barrier mechanism. This includes the zonulae occludens, the desmosomes and hemidesmosomes, whereas the endothelium is not that effective since it has very tiny leaky channels that allow the fluid to pass through the stroma. Coming on to the metabolic pump, the water transportation occurs in association with the ions transported by different active pump mechanisms like the sodium potassium ATPase pump, bicarbonate dependent ATPase pump, carbonic anhydrase enzyme system, and the sodium hydrogen pump. Here, as you can see here, this is the epithelium, this is the endothelium, and this middle portion is the stroma, which contains the negatively charged GAGs. These are very highly hydrophilic as we discussed, and hence they attract the water molecules. The endothelium, this has very tiny leaks and hence it acts in the pump mechanism. It allows the water inside the stroma, which are attracted by negatively charged GAGs, which further passes it on to the epithelium. Then it moves on to the tear film layer and finally gets evaporated. This is the same thing that's written for the evaporation of water from corneal surface. Coming on to the metabolism part, it is required to produce energy for maintenance of transparency and hydration both. There are 2 active layers participating in this. These are the epithelium and endothelium. This process is generated by breakdown of glucose in the form of ATP. There are three different pathways that take place for the formation for the metabolism process. They are the glycolytic pathway, the HMP shunt, and the sorbitol pathway. Finally, the nutrition of the cornea is derived in three different ways. The aqueous humor provides the glucose, oxygen, and amino acid to the cornea. The precorneal tear film and the perilimbal capillaries, both of them provide the glucose to the cornea.